Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth.
Hello. Hello, you good people, and welcome to Life on Earth. Thank you for joining us. Yes, today's special guest, my favorite person in the whole world. This is Amy Nasir. You might remember her from past episodes of Life on Earth before she went off on a solo career. No, she's been working all along. And
yes, I've been working here in Michigan to spread the good news.
The good news of what?
Objectivism.
Objectivism. Oh, I thought you were going to say the Henry Ford.
Oh, the Henry
That
Ford.
too.
That too.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Hello, you good people.
Did you hear about the good news?
Have you heard the good news of our anniversary?
Yes.
Next Friday, Amy and I will celebrate our 22nd wedding anniversary.
Wow.
Feel free to share your congratulations in the chat. Now, we've talked about marriage before, and in fact, our previous wedding anniversary was very public because photographs were posted of our wedding vow renewal at the Henry Ford in Greenfield Village in the Martha Mary Chapel. The year before that, we did a Zoom vow renewal with Andrew Bernstein. Zoom. Do you remember living in Zoom? Does everybody remember being stuck in that Zoom fishbowl?
Yeah.
But it was very romantic nonetheless. We talked about marriage before, but that was then. And this is now. And I've got a few new, useful, and fun insights to add to the discussion.
Okay.
But since this is 2022, you know, the year those crazy conservatives managed to strike down Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs decision on June 24th. And this action is part of a movement which potentially threatens Obergefell versus Hodges. So marriage in America needs to be defended, but not just because of those rascally conservatives who posture as defenders of marriage. No. We, the men and women of reason and values, we are just the ones to do it. Now, I did a series called Secrets of a Successful Marriage, came out of a Valentine's Week post in 2014. And I posted 5, and I swear I don't have a thing for 5s. I know I just did 5 tips for happiness. That was controversial, you remember that. But no, my 5 secrets for a successful marriage. And the first secret was define your terms. If you want a successful marriage, know what marriage is. And that sounds silly, it sounds obvious, but man, how many marriages have we attended where just listening to the wedding vows, you could tell people had no idea what marriage was. I mean, they know what it kind of looks like. And, you know, my parents were married and it's, you know, people are together and there's kind of a commitment. They have no idea what marriage actually is. So one of the secrets for a successful marriage is to know what marriage is. Marriage is legal, logistical, romantic. And each one of those 3 elements is essential. If you don't have those 3 elements, what you have may be called a marriage by extension, but it's not a marriage. Marriage is a public declaration to the world at large, including the legal system, that from this moment on, 2 people are to be regarded as one unit. A team, a partnership, a corporation, you know, in law, in terms of family and household, in terms of romance too. 2 people become one unit. You know, it's like a small business or an LLC. I don't know. Do we have limited liability in a marriage? But there are legal ramifications in uniting to create a partnership, making a household. I know some people think the government should not be involved in marriage. If you're one of those folks, I would ask you to reconsider that idea. It just isn't so. Marriage affects property. It affects medical rights. It affects 1,000 different voluntary agreements and contracts which rely on that legal definition and recognition of marriage, of 2 people functioning as a single unit. And that really is the thing, is that 2 people become a unit.
As Daniel in the chat asks, is marriage a corporation?
It could well be. No, it's not literally a corporation, but you know, a corporation is a legal fiction. Well, it's not a fiction, but it is a legal, what's the word I'm looking for? A legal entity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we say, well, corporations aren't people. Well, no, they're not people. They are groups of people, but they are legal entities.
Yes.
Something different is happening when you get together and run a business in a limited liability situation, and you produce products that can only be produced given the legal protections of limited liability. There are certain things you couldn't do just as 1,000 individuals all getting together and making individual agreements without that overriding. Anyway, not getting too much into corporate
Well,
and corporations, but marriage is the same way.
I mean, at least in Michigan, we have what's called no fault divorce. That
Yes.
you don't need to prove cheating, abandonment, cruelty, or anything else to get a divorce. Same thing with, if you're employed at a corporation and you leave it, you don't need to, go to a judge and prove that they treated you badly.
Right.
Yeah.
And I actually like that comparison because although I like the idea of no fault divorce, I do think you should have the option of deciding ahead of time, well, if this partnership is going to dissolve, here are the limitations or the conditions. We do that, for example, in terms of property with prenuptial agreements. And I think we should be able to do that. And with that in place, with at least the option to do that, then yeah, I'm a big fan of no fault marriage, or excuse me, no fault divorce. Actually, I'm a big fan of no fault marriage too. It's one of my secrets of a successful marriage. That's why the answer is always yes. Well, if marriage is those
What would that
three
be?
things,
What would that be? No fault marriage?
no fault marriage.
I just woke up one day and I was married to somebody, and no fault of mine, no fault of his. Just happened.
Well, I don't think that's what no fault means in divorce either. But I do have something to say about that, which I will get to. But back to those three things. Marriage is legal. And again, there's 100 reasons why, yes, the government has a role to play that have to do with not just property rights, but you're in the hospital. Who gets to decide for you when you're not able? Who is the default when you pass away? Well, your things go to your family and your spouse, even before your blood relatives. There are all sorts of things about marriage that is a legal situation. But the third element, legal, logistical, romantic, we've had friends point out that historically, marriage and romance were two separate things. There's some truth in this. A good friend of mine gave me a whole book on the history of marriage that talks about, all the ways in which marriage was different 200, 300, 1,000 years ago.
Yes, dowries and
Yes.
you had a word in there.
Bride price.
Bride
Yes.
price. I mean, yeah. And yeah, it's the
Yeah, you can have my daughter as long as you can prove you're financially worthy and have something to offer our family, because families are important and all that. And you hear about that and you think maybe there's some kernel of truth to this, that marriage didn't used to be about romance. But the great romances go back to ancient times.
yeah.
Homer was 800 BC and wrote about Odysseus and Penelope. You had Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the great romances, and more recently Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. The great romances of history, John and Abigail Adams, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. Okay, maybe not that one.
You're just seeing if we're paying attention.
That's right. There's a man who knew how to keep his wife in line. Well, maybe not. Now, we don't practice dowries and bride price anymore. And fortunately, most of the world has given up on arranged marriages and things like that. Still,
Yeah.
people do get married for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, there's a movie which I don't recommend, but it's called Dangerous Beauty.
Dangerous
I just
Beauty.
remember the scene in it where it was so dramatic, that the man purchases the bride and basically she's just not even,
Doesn't want to be there.
She doesn't want to be there, and she's just going to be a baby making factory, I suppose, if
Yeah.
he's going to go off with her or with his mistress.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it used to be a stereotype of conservatives that women were repressed, and so many women were taught, get married and just lay there and put up with what your husband's going to do to you. It's one of your duties of marriage.
Grab the book, while the deed is done.
And again, marriage has always been complicated. It's always been like this. We had marriages of convenience. Think of Ayn Rand's friend Adrian, for example, who was in a marriage of convenience back in the 1920s, 1930s, the gay 20s. Unfortunately, you couldn't be gay and out in the 20s. And so there were these quote unquote marriages of convenience where a man and a woman would be married, but only because one of the two was homosexual.
Yeah.
And you had to put up a front. And, there are other reasons for marriage beyond that. But the number one reason, again, look at fiction, look at history, has always been romance. And I love the fact that it's even more that now than in history. And the reason why I love it so much is because there's a view right now among a certain group of people, certain kinds of folks, and a lot of young people who don't feel this, but they think this is what's going on. Marriage is obsolete. Marriage is on the way out. And even long-term committed relationships are on their way out. And by the time we're done, I hope you will say, oh, yeah, that's out there, but it's not true. Now, in defining marriage, I often get pushback about children. Some people argue that raising a family belongs somewhere in the definition of marriage. And while I'd certainly agree that a successful marriage provides the ideal context for raising children, there's too many counterexamples for that to be part of the definition. Children can be and are conceived and successfully raised outside of wedlock, as some of us know all too well. Likewise, childless couples can and should be married for all the same essential reasons as couples who are expecting to have kids and raise a family. So yes, the introduction of children into marriage is common precisely because the legal and logistical and loving framework provided by marriage is ideal for providing the environment and structure and stability and the lifetime commitment that producing little versions of you requires. But while what marriage is makes it ideal for raising children doesn't make marriage what it is. I'm going to give some more of these successful marriage tips before I get into kind of the meat and potatoes. So real quick, tip number 2, remember number 1 was know what marriage is. Tip number 2, successful marriage is knowing the virtue of pride and applying that to your marriage. Mm-hmm. And we talked about pride before as a virtue because a lot of people treat it as a value. They treat it as self-esteem. But acting with pride, applying pride to your life is actually a virtue. It's something you do.
And it's something that you work towards.
Yes.
That just doesn't fall into your lap. It's not something that you can do passively.
No, it is almost synonymous with ambition. It's been described as moral ambition. Mm-hmm. Pride is something you do.
Yes.
Not just something you achieve as self-esteem. It's obvious that consistent, principled honesty and integrity are prerequisites to long-term matrimonial happiness. And similarly, rationality and productiveness and justice. And yes, in a healthy marriage, independence is especially important. You mustn't lose yourself in a marriage. But what does it mean to be proud of your spouse? It means not just that fun feeling of having a hottie on your arm, although I certainly enjoy that and have nothing against that.
Or I mean, it means to admire them, but it's more than that.
It's more than that. Think of it, when you perform your work, when you do your job with pride, or when you care for or maintain your house or your automobile, when you nurture your children, when you stay in shape, dress and groom yourself well, it's clear that pride is more than the value of self-esteem. It's an active virtue. And the care and maintenance of your marriage, of your spouse, requires that you love and nurture and defend your loved one with pride, just as you do your profession or your house or your automobile or your body. Ask yourself the question, am I proud of my spouse? And be prepared to answer not just in regard to their virtue, but in regard to yours. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just looking into reasons why people are saying that a traditional marriage is on the way out. Well, traditional marriage, first of all, you need to define the term of that. Are you talking about, June and Ward Cleaver? Or are you, looking at something a little bit more realistic for nowadays. And it says in 1960, 72% of Americans were married, and it fell to 51% in 2011.
Yes.
But, it really it's sort of, people are kind of redefining what the ideal relationship is. People are perhaps taking their time and getting married. This is not wartime in the sense of, World War I or II, where people are, oh, we better get married now before you go off to war.
Yes.
So there's no urgency for that.
Yeah, and mores have changed. You could argue whether it's for the better or the worse, but if somebody gets pregnant, you're much less likely to have a shotgun wedding. Pa shows up on the front porch with the shotgun and says, "You got my daughter in a family way, you're going to do the right thing," right? It's just not like that anymore.
No. As far as religious attitudes, people, I think there is kind of a reactionary attitude towards it, where people look at religion and they're not religious anymore, and they're like, no, I'm not going to have a church wedding.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in going to church.
It's very much
having any religion in my life. And so let's figure out this whole marriage thing in that context. And sometimes that's hard to figure out.
Yeah. And a lot of people throw the baby out with the bathwater and think, well, if marriage had a religious element and I'm not religious, or if marriage is over-governed, over-legislated, over-regulated by the government, you got to get marriage licenses and marriage tests in the old days. And I don't believe in any of that, so I don't believe in marriage. Yeah, there's a lot of that. I think there's swinging in the other direction on the phenomenon of too many baby daddies, too many people not taking those responsibilities as seriously as they should. But
that might be getting better.
And I was going to say, it's another one of those cases where, because of the internet, we have the sense it happens all the time. And I don't know that it happens that much more than it did when I was young. And it's been a few years since I was young. So let me just take a minute before I give tip number 3 here, which is a real quick one. But even quicker than that, I want to go to the super chat, because Jeff Manister in with $5 Canadian says, good job supporting the ARCUK. Thank you for that. Any money y'all put in, tie it to a question in the super chat. It goes to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. And that is who is hosting this show today. So thank you very much, Jeff. Also, Sense of Mind, which is an interesting YouTube handle. Sense of Mind is in for $4 and says, love this, plus your other show with Valiant Things. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I especially enjoyed this week's show with James. We talked about Leonard Peikoff. Who is this guy? And it was a great episode, I thought, which I wasn't sure it was going to be. Because, it seemed like maybe it's going to be a little too journalistic, I love Leonard Peikoff, but if you don't necessarily want to hear an hour of that. But James has such great stories and anecdotes and insights.
I mean, he made the point, I guess, that Leonard Peikoff had an opportunity to compromise and to, I think he had a counselor or somebody like that who was helping him.
Oh yeah, it was his PhD advisor, Sidney Hook.
Right.
Who liked him, even though they had opposite politics. Hook thought, well, we're both very independent. He thought Leonard was great. And you're right. James told the story about how Sidney Hook said, and once you graduate, if you grow out of these objectivist ideas, of course, you'll have to do that, but then I can get you jobs. I can find positions for you. And Leonard explained that he never grew up in that way, fortunately.
Yeah. And one more quick point about that was that, even though Leonard Peikoff had, some issues working out and not, unintegrating rationalistic tendencies in his thinking, you could tell right off the bat that he wasn't going to be a rationalist for long. I mean, you have to be very courageous not to be a rationalist, in the sense that you're not in the sense of if you're just going to be using philosophy or ideas to look good in front of other people, you're not going to have the courage to go up to Ayn Rand and keep asking her questions, no matter how ridiculous they might sound to Ayn Rand and to anybody around him. He kept asking those questions. He didn't consider those questions to be stupid. Well, maybe he thought it did, but he worked through that and he kept at it. That takes a lot.
It's funny because, Ayn Rand has made the point, and a lot of others have too, that when people accuse objectivists of being dogmatic or being faith-based or being, blind followers, she would often say, well, fortunately, this philosophy, more than any other set of ideas out there, is fully protected against that. Nobody with that kind of psychology is going to survive as an objectivist. But, as you point out, Amy, who more so was put in that position than the one guy who worked with Ayn Rand more than anybody else? Imagine being a dogmatist, or even, having some degree of rationalistic tendencies. No,
Right.
she would straighten that out right away. So yes, anyway, thank you very much for that sense of mind. I enjoyed that episode, and I enjoy those shows with James as well. Real quick, tip number 3, secrets of a successful marriage. Never forget how you feel about the people you love. You say, well, how you think about them, how you feel about them. Love is an emotion, but it's also an evaluation. When you say to somebody, I love you, you're not just saying, at this moment, I've got this big feeling. You are saying that, but what you're saying much more than that is, I hold you as an extraordinary value, and I appreciate you. I'm grateful that you're in my life, and I'm willing to do what it takes to show you that appreciation and give you what you just. Love is an evaluation as well as an emotion. And there's going to be moments in your life, young people might not know this, but people my age probably do. There's going to be moments in your life where, in regard to the people you love, your friends, your family, even your spouse, you're not going to feel that emotion, or at least not as richly, as strongly as you do the evaluation. That's fine. Never forget the evaluation. Whatever you go through, never forget, this is somebody I love. This is the most important person in my life. And I might not be feeling it in this moment, say during an argument, or during kind of a downtime in your relationships, because relationships have their ups and downs.
Yeah.
Never forget, well, this is the person I love. This person is more important to me than anybody else in the world. So even if you don't feel it, act accordingly.
Yeah, there's one context that's very particular to this time period, which is coming out of the pandemic.
Oh.
And during the pandemic of, holing up with your spouse and working from home. It was hard. I mean, it wasn't the most impossible thing Robert and I have been through, but there's nothing impossible about it, but it was difficult. And I think for a lot of people, it was very difficult. And you've got to acknowledge that, because when you're in the midst of working from home and, somebody is overpromising and under delivering, and you're trying to work with them, and you have deadlines, and there's a lot of stress, particularly in the job that I have, it can be difficult to be in the same building, that being home while working, and having to separate those two. They talk about work-life balance. Well, it's not even so much about what you act on, it's how you feel and the kind of emotional baggage that you have around the house, because you are stressed at work, for instance. So you have to really be conscientious about that.
Yeah, work has its ups and downs, and relationships have their ups and downs. And when you work in your home with the person with whom you're in a relationship, and the downs on one run headlong into the downs of the other, that separation is a good thing. And yes, I absolutely agree with that. I'll skip tip number 4, which is just put some effort into understanding romance, masculinity, femininity, because we did a whole show on masculinity and femininity. In fact, there's a whole bunch of links that I've posted on my Facebook wall, facebook.com/Robert Nasir. There's also a link in Twitter. All sorts of great and related stuff. If you haven't seen our shows, Amy and my shows on masculinity and femininity, or on marriage, any of the other stuff we talked about in the past, they're all in there. I think they're all worth a watch.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't have put them in there if they
too.
weren't. And finally, tip number 5 is the answer is yes. The answer is always yes. Whatever your spouse wants, the answer is always yes. Of course, there are exceptions to this. If your spouse really, really deeply and is willing to ask you for something that would provide financial ruin to your partnership, you might have a conversation about that before you say yes. But in terms of the simple things,
Honey,
can we go out to dinner this Friday?
what's our limit on our charge card?
Well, we don't do charge cards, but we're doing something creative with a charge card right now. So maybe we will use a charge card. has something to do with the end of the year, the fiscal budget, and traveling to Japan next year.
Yes.
But always say yes, anytime it's possible. And this is surprisingly simple and doable, but it's also really unusual to adopt that as a policy. That makes it challenging, but equivalently or proportionally rewarding. It's good to know there's somebody who is always there for you,
Yes.
and not just always there because they have to be or out of duty, but because they want to be in your corner.
Yes.
And a policy of the answer is always yes, I think helps with that. It certainly does for me. You know, in 2016, 4 years ago, it's funny how we do the year thing. Like the 80s was 20 years ago, and wait, the 80s was 40 years ago, and 2016 was 6 years ago. In 2016, back when I was young, I posted a somewhat edgy post in response to the meme that was going around. It asked you to do 10 unpopular beliefs. What are 10 unpopular beliefs that you hold? And they're supposed to be non-political, which makes it an extra challenge for objectivists, as you can imagine. And my unpopular belief number 9 was, these are unpopular, so I was kind of being a little mean there. You don't know what marriage is, which is why most marriages don't work. Nobody knows what marriage is. And I put that out there and made that point that marriage is a public declaration, a legal commitment to romance, shared property and responsibilities. And if you know this, if you know what marriage is, if you know just this much, you have a much better chance of making a marriage work, or even a romantic relationship work, if you understand what it means to be a unit, to be a partner legally and logistically, and especially in terms of that declaration to the world. You're dealing with her, you're dealing with me.
If you're dealing with him, you're dealing with me.
You have a much better chance of success. Now, this year, 2022, with the repeal of Roe versus Wade in June.
Before you get into that, I just want to say,
yes.
When you were talking about the answer is always yes.
Yes.
That can be, there's a caveat to that. The answer is always like yes, as long as you are both communicating your needs to each other. And before then, the prerequisite is that you need to know what you want, which can be a challenge, to know exactly what you want and to, it would be able to communicate to your partner what you need in a way that they can understand. Not beating around the bush, just come right out with it and tell them what you need. I need whatever it is. And so because if you fall into the trap of mind reading and you're not communicating, or you're assuming the worst of each other, which is even worse than that, the answer yes in that context can be very dangerous.
Yeah,
it really sets you up for a lot of failure and a lot of heartache and a lot of resentment and a lot of guilt, and then comes codependency. And so you've got to communicate. You need to know what you really want, and you need to define what you want.
I'm totally codependent, but I probably don't mean that the way you mean that.
No.
Yes. Yeah, that's why when I mentioned how all of the 7 virtues apply to marriage, I opened up with honesty and integrity. And, marriage is probably the closest you get to a situation where radical honesty would work. Except it really doesn't. If you know that concept of radical honesty, you don't hold anything back. You say whatever is on your mind, you let it all out. If somebody looks bad today, you tell them, hey, you look bad today.
No.
Whatever comes across your mind. So I've always said radical honesty is neither radical nor honest. But a marriage is the closest thing. You do want to be as wide open as you can get yourself to be.
Vulnerable. Yes.
And transparent.
Yeah, Tom in the chat says you should always have an option that someone can say yes to.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yes.
That's good. Yeah. Don't ask for things you don't want. Well, I do want it. Well, you think about, do you really want that to happen?
Yes.
So yes, we had the repeal of Roe versus Wade. And you think, well, what's that got to do with marriage? That's the abortion thing, right? But the trouble is that conservatives, a substantial number of conservatives, have made it clear that they intend to use this to continue to work in the direction of repealing or modifying Obergefell. Obergefell versus Hodges, the 2015 ruling that made gay marriage universal across the United States. There are still conservatives who would love to see the right of same-sex couples to marriage overturned. Now, I personally love and defend same-sex marriage for the same reasons I champion marriage in general. And some of the sweetest couples I know, including objectivist couples, some of the people who are raising some of the most charming children you're ever going to meet, are same-sex couples.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I
just love.
You just want to shout them out, don't you?
I just want to shout them out. I won't.
Put the names out there.
But they're just, and it makes me so happy for the children, who are being raised by, two dads or two moms or however. Especially, I wish I had two dads growing up, but still.
I would like to have had two parents. Yeah.
I would have liked to have one dad, but but yeah. It's just so wonderful and just very sweet.
Yeah. And the fact of same-sex marriage it's one more bit of evidence that marriage is an institution that is not going away. If marriage was going away, if marriage was becoming obsolete in the 21st century, same-sex marriage wouldn't have been an issue. They'd be like, well, who cares? Nobody's doing that anymore anyway. With the internet, with being connected to all of you all the time, well, that's great because you people are awesome. But also everything else going out in the world, sure, there's a world of good news. Go to humanprogress.org and you can see good news all day, every day, but go to the regular news. Or, worse, go into any of the cesspools, go into the average YouTube comment section or Reddit forum, or worse. It's all too easy to see the manosphere and, the players and the game and Tinder and, God forbid, Grindr and the players and the narcissist and the MGTOWs, the men going their own way and the incels, and to see all of this stuff out there as evidence that romance is dying and marriage is a throwback to the past. But out here, in the real world, in meat space,
it's the real world.
Romance in general, and marriage in particular, is not just still going strong, it's getting better all the time, even as some of the statistics are going down a little bit. In art, in music, in fiction, in film, love stories still rule the day. Marriage stats are down a little bit. But when people are getting married, it's as big a celebration as ever. And young people are continuing to find new ways to celebrate their commitments. Take the top 20 films of the last year, or any given year recently, and look at how many of them have a plot point which includes a love story.
Yes.
And often marriage as the end of that. And the same with music. Look at the lyrics of music. Or look at any of the new fiction that's out there. How many stories don't include a love story? Very few.
When I was very, very young, when I was a little girl or a teenager, I couldn't quite understand why there were so many love songs. Especially when I was a philosophical teenager, into existentialism and other things. I just thought, why are people talking about the things that really matter? All the problems you need to solve, and politics and anarchy and morality and
your favorite artist that you thought was so edgy, he just came out with a love song. Oh man.
Yeah. And why are we focusing so much on love songs? And and you know, of course, I've learned a little bit more since then. And no, it's very, very important to have love songs. I recommend anything by Ella Fitzgerald myself, but yeah, it's really important to have that friend, that mirror, that you know, the other you to look to, and to encourage them to do their best, and they encourage you to do your best. It's a great thing to have.
Yes. You know, even areas that might seem disruptive or bad in terms of romance, and I think now of intersectionality, or the not just the transgender movement, but the annihilation of gender. While as movements, they are destructive to definitions of men, women, masculinity, and femininity. Even these, nonetheless, these people are choosing new versions of existing as men, as women. If you're born a woman, but you identify as a man, then woman, what you're saying you were born as and don't identify with, and man, what you're saying you now identify with, they must mean something. Woman and man mean something. And I know they'll fall back on the idea, well, it's a social construct. Construct based on what? It's obviously not just arbitrary. Out here in the real world, men and women, and sometimes men and men, or women and women, all of that stuff aside, we continue to live our own best lives, and we fall in love. And, you know, sometimes when we've made a final choice and we want to build something magnificent out of it, we still choose a partnership, a united front, a unit. People are still choosing marriage.
You know, it's lovely to have a travel partner, somebody you can talk to about your deepest values in life, your thoughts that you come up with, the integrations that you're like, wow, I can't believe I survived yesterday not knowing what I know today. And talking with somebody about that.
Yes.
It's really a wonderful thing, and I highly recommend it. And whether, you know, the marriage issue in terms of it being a legal contract, there are a lot of really great upsides to that. And I know for some people, they've been together for a very long time, like Goldie Hawn and
Kurt Russell.
Kurt Russell are not married.
They have decided not to be married.
Right.
And I would say they have a better marriage than some of the married couples I know.
True.
So yes, there are exceptions.
There are exceptions. So, I mean, it's not to say that we're promoting some sort of intrinsic value that, you know, you must do. It's this dogma or something.
No, I love Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell. I love that they have made that work and decided that that's the best format for their relationship to be. That's great. There are as many complications to marriage as there are to life.
Yeah. You know, and sometimes we had a note here from Gerard. He says, in terms of, you know, gay marriage and everything, he says they have a right to be just as miserable as the rest of us. Just kidding. Wah, wah, wah. But
see, I appreciate that. I think we need not to step too lightly around these issues, and a little humor can be a good thing.
Yeah. So you were saying, because I'm forgetting what I was going to say.
I was just going to ask, well, should you be able to force a baker to bake you a gay cake?
No.
How about an atheist cake?
Oh, yeah.
You can force him to do that.
Sure.
I mean, really, if I have to take the baker to court in order to force him to bake me a cake in the shape of a $sign, do I really want to trust eating that cake?
No.
He might not be poisoned. It might just taste awful. Who knows what he would do to it? For a discussion of that, in the show notes, I did put a link into Slicing into the Gay Wedding Cake Case by Steve Simpson, Onkar Gate, and Elan Journo. And there's also a short Yaron Brook clip, Do Bigots Have a Right to Discriminate? A question that virtually answers itself by being asked in that way. But it's a great clip. Take a look at that after the show. After 29 years together, 22 of them being happily married. Yes, we waited a while. I can say that love, like life, is not always simple. Oh, I didn't mean to put the special effect in there. It's not always simple and it's not always easy. But like life, barring some substantial tragedy, love is always worth it. Now, in today's show title, I deliberately played on the Defense of Marriage Act. It was offered by a Republican Congress, but to the Democrat Bill Clinton, who signed it into law. It was signed into law by Democratic president, 1996. At the time, Mrs. Clinton was also against same-sex marriage. Yeah, she's a Democrat too, by the way. It's hard to believe that was 26 years ago that DOMA passed, and that same-sex marriage has since been legal federally, but only for the last 7 years. And it makes me appreciate marriage all the more, that people feel so strongly about this issue. See, values matter. Love matters. Romance, and commitment, and hard work, and family, and loyalty, and adventure, and passion matters. Marriage matters. Marriage mattered to Ayn Rand.
Yes.
She was married to one man her entire life.
Yes.
And she had an interesting love life. We all know there were unusual aspects of that. But despite all of that, her marriage endured. It mattered.
Yes.
It meant something. And her characters, Howard Rourke and Dominique, at the end of The Fountainhead, whoops, where's my spoiler alert? Well, those of you who've read the book, you know what happens. Hank Rearden should have married Dagny Taggart. The whole story would have been different, but the happy ending would have come much sooner, at least for two of the people in the story. And again, it's so easy to look at the way things are now, to look at, I mentioned, for example, the manosphere. And there's a flip side to that, too. There's women out there who are just as irrational in regard to commitment and marriage and virtue in the context of romantic relationships. But none of this is new.
No, I mean, none of it is new. And in terms of women, unfortunately, a lot of women end up getting married and then their attitudes towards men come out, and it's they belittle their partner, or they
although I put them in the category of those people, I said they don't even know what marriage is.
No.
And they went and got married.
Yeah.
How do you expect that to work out? But you're familiar with the term gold diggers?
Right.
Men nowadays talk about how women just want you for your money and you should just use them for their bodies. The term gold diggers, there are actually Hollywood films. I forget the years involved, but there's like a film called Gold Diggers of 1929. And it's, a comedy, adventure, musical. But the point is, yes, those women have been out there since there have been women. And those men, those narcissists, but not just narcissists, the users and the tough guy who goes from one gal to another. And we've always laughed about it because we know we don't want that. But it's just so silly, because I'm a wanderer, I roam around.
Papa was
the cool guy, get girls in every city he went to. The point is, it's nothing new. It looks different now than it did in the past. And it's so easy to say, oh man, women, the way they treat you, and the way the divorce courts treat you, and men should go their own way. Oh, I just shudder at the very idea of that. None of it is new. And I still attend weddings of people getting married. People still, and they always will. People falling deeply in love.
Yeah.
And even people who aren't as philosophical as I'd like to see them, but who are deeply committed to one another.
Yes.
All the world loves a love story. It has always been true, at least since Homer, 800 BC, and it will always be true.
Daniel says, this marriage you talk about sounds really good, Robert Amy. Can I join you?
It's a pretty good deal. It's a pretty good deal.
Well, I think that I'm sure that there is a lovely person out there for you to have adventures with, Daniel.
Oh, I would go further and I would say there are a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
But you will meet one that will stand out and you will say, there might be a better woman out there. Don't want her. I want this woman in my life for good. And I don't believe in indissoluble marriage. Things may change 20 or 30 years from now. And I don't necessarily think that a marriage that only lasts 20 years is a failure if it was a good marriage, but things changed. So I'm not trying to say there's some transcendent thing or some duty or obligation to make it last forever. But you get married when you realize this is the person I want to be with. I want to keep building what we've got with this person, and I don't want to be with anyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you can have your own little
Love story.
As Ayn Rand would put it, well, she called Frank O'Connor cubbyhole and he called her kitten fluff.
Yes.
So you can find your own kitten fluff out there somewhere.
And she also said he was her rock of Gibraltar when she would feel
Yes.
bad about the world or bad about the struggles they faced or bad about the future. He was her rock of Gibraltar. Imagine being Ayn Rand's rock of Gibraltar.
Yes. He was the one who inspired her to write The Fountainhead. So there you have it. I really wish that we had some video with his voice, on it so that we could get to know Frank O'Connor a little bit better.
That would have been something. Fortunately, at least we can read the 100 answers and some
Facets of Ayn Rand.
facets of Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
Even the old Who is Ayn Rand, or a bit of biography there. Yeah, you're right. We get these tantalizing glimpses of this charming man.
Yeah, and I want to go back to radical honesty, the idea that you're going to blurt out whatever comes into your mind, like a stream of consciousness sort of conversation.
Yeah. Turns out real honesty is harder than that.
Real honesty requires integration, understanding who you're talking to and what they need, why you like them. And there's a certain way that you can stylize. It's one of the things about human relationships is that if you're just doing radical honesty, it would just be, you wouldn't have a chance, you wouldn't give yourself the joy of stylizing what you're going to say to them or do with them or come up with clever things and adventures to go on. Whether that's, surprise parties or picnics or, bring home little gifts, there's so much opportunity for stylization in a relationship. And we were just talking about that actually a couple of weeks ago about, even how you kiss your partner really says a lot. Do you just peck them on the cheek, peck them on the lips for a quick second when you could give them a long, 6 to 10 second kiss and really be present with them and really be with them, really acknowledge their existence and acknowledge why you love them. So
yeah, those 6-second kisses are a good idea.
Yes.
The challenge there, of course, is you don't want to do that out loud. 1, 2, because it makes it hard to kiss somebody. No, what I mean is you don't want to
you count your fingers.
You don't want to do that as a hard and fast rule where it's just artificial.
No.
But yes, if you find that you are only kissing people, your spouse, briefly, and it's become a habit and you never have a lingering kiss anymore, count to 6 by all means. Do that a few times. It will put you back in good habits. And just realized I hadn't scheduled Clubhouse, but there will be a Clubhouse after the show today. But before I wrap up, a quick story. After 35 years of marriage, a husband and wife go in for marriage counseling. When asked what the problem was, the wife went into a tirade, listing every problem they ever had in the years that they have been married. On and on and on. Neglect, lack of intimacy, emptiness, loneliness, feeling unloved and unlovable, an entire laundry list of unmet needs. Finally, after allowing this for a sufficient length of time, the therapist got up, walked around the desk, and asked her, after asking the wife to stand, he embraced and kissed her long and passionately as her husband watched with a raised eyebrow. The woman shut up and quietly sat down as if in a daze. The therapist turned to the husband and said, "This is what your wife needs at least 3 times a week. Can you do this?" To which he replied, "Well, I can drop her off here on Mondays and Wednesdays, but on Fridays I go fishing." Everything you need to know about marriage is contained somewhere within that joke. But
on Fridays I go fishing.
Yes. Yeah, your therapist can't give your wife what she needs. But also your wife has needs.
Mhm.
But also you don't do those things for her sake. You do them for your sake.
But also it's up to her to communicate those needs. Yes.
But also, there are links to all of my secrets of a successful marriage, the previous podcasts that we have done on marriage and masculinity and femininity in the show notes, facebook.com/Robert Nasir. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you were here. Next week, we celebrate 22 years of marriage, 29 years together. Thank you for being a small part of that. And I, and my special guest, Amy Nasir, we wish you a passionate life on earth.